I constantly have to deal with libertarians and anarcho-capitalists who are well-meaning. And I don't intend to offend them. But again, it's very difficult to try to explain over and over and over the same points. Go read my article on economic nominalism. Read my article and my interviews with Tim Kelly about libertarianism and liberalism. And what we have to understand is that the modern world has for centuries imbibed liberalism. Libertarianism is an older form of liberalism. It's classical liberalism. Now, a lot of libertarians know this. And the mythology, the propaganda that they believe is that this was a freedom from the feudal system. It was a great step forward. This was an advancement, for humanity. And now we can have private companies, private operations. And out of this actually came things like the British East India Company and so forth. Now, this economic theory, this view, actually became the mode and the means for globalism. Now, this is ironic because at the same time that this was being taught, economic atomism, you had in the realms of philosophy and in the realms of science and in the realm of humanities and so forth, their own versions of liberalism. And in those versions of liberalism, it became a primacy of the individual, right? An autonomous individual set against a collective many in the state or whatever, right? We can think of Hobbes's Leviathan, right? Well, this full flowering of the liberal idea is precisely what I oppose. And almost all modern discourse and almost all the entire modern world has caved to this liberalism. And so the discourse that goes on YouTube, except for certain people who will debate with the libertarians and make this point, the discourse that goes on, in the blogosphere and in modern political books, when you walk in a Barnes and Noble and you see these rows of, next to the manga, you see the rows of, these talking head writers that have, Michael Savage and so forth. And who's that one guy? The bald Democrat guy that's been writing books forever and used to be married to the Republican. Isn't that an interesting pairing there? That guy, the bald, weird guy married to the Republican bitchy chick, and you have like this marriage that, now, so we've all kind of become familiarized with this false dialectic of the left-right paradigm. But the false left-right paradigm of America doesn't begin in modern Democrat versus GOP strategies. It doesn't begin at the Civil War. It actually goes back much further. It goes back to the French Revolution, and even prior to that, in the philosophical ideas that were beginning to spread in the late Middle Ages throughout Europe. Now, I've covered that in countless talks and lectures. People need to really, I think, familiarize themselves with this stuff because they're actually debating systems that they don't even realize undermine them. And we see this in this complete contradiction in characters like Stefan Molyneux or Styx and Hexen and Hammer, who on the one hand will try to argue for things like borders and they'll act like these issues can be sort of parceled out one by one just through the use of reason and logic. And at the same time, they are struggling or they are unclear about what exactly ethnic identity means. Is there such a thing as ethnos? Is there a God? No. Well, if there's not, then why are we bound to any of these principles? I mean, any of these metaphysical principles and absolutes that you're trying to propound, such as the idea of a people group or an ethnos or an identity or any kind of philosophical, mathematical concept, if those are objective realities, then we need kind of an explanation or philosophy as to how that is. And you're never going to get that on all of their atheistic presuppositions. And most of those systems are atheistic. Now, some of them might find favor in things like esotericism or whatever. There's nothing there. You're not going to find anything that gives you a worldview in the arts of esotericism and hermeticism. In fact, it's those things that lead directly to quantification and the atomism of Newton and of the British Royal Society and the worldview of the technocrats, which is where we are now. So this brings us to Davos. This brings us up to the now, which is Do you want Americanism or do you want globalism? Americanism, not globalism. Now, that sounds good. And yes, in terms of what he's disagreeing with globalism, I would agree. But the problem is that America and Americanism is globalism. It's not hard to figure that out. America is the beta version of the New World Order and globalism. Francis Bacon wrote a book about this. So all the people who worship Americanism, this is really just an idol. It's idolatry. Because it's a replacement religion. And this is what happens. This is what you see in all these movements and these people online. Man is fundamentally religious, and he's going to erect his worldview, his system, around whatever his basic presuppositions are. And if they are things like naturalism, Darwinism, Nietzscheanism, whatever, that gives these online people the appearance that they think that they're gods in their own mind because they're famous on YouTube or something, you're echoing nothing. You will not be read 100 years from now. 500 years from now, no one's going to be reading you. If people are even reading, hopefully they will be. But when we look back to the history of Western civilization, when we look back to the history of Byzantium and Orthodox civilization, we read St. Basil, we read St. Athanasius, we read these great thinkers. We read some of the Romans, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, things like that. But we're not going to be reading, YouTubers. Because really what we have in this realm of this discourse on YouTube is a giant echo chamber of very lowest common denominator simple stuff. I mean, we're dealing with very basic stuff. We're dealing with people who are not getting a philosophical grounding. And that's what I try to do. That's what I'm trying to bring here to the table. There's no such thing as a completely neutral approach to any of these questions. Everybody has a worldview. Everybody has presuppositions and positions on things. Even if they don't want them to be there, you still have them by default. It's impossible. Even if you're agnostic, you still are taking some kind of position. So what I'm trying to get here is that we're not going to solve this problem or these issues through YouTube videos or through more blogs or through this or that or writing a book, because it's an info war, and the war here is spiritual ultimately. So what I want to stress at this point is that the hierarchy of how man views himself in the world has been inverted. I've covered over and over and over the white papers that actually discussed how to invert and subvert that, changing images of man, things like this. So what has to happen is that the inversion has to be reverted back to the way it needs to be. And that means that first and foremost for man, it is spiritual issues. Those come first. Then we have the things like the philosophy and the family and the social issues and things like that. That comes next. And race or ethnicity can be classed as part of that. That is, in other words, you caring for your people is just a broader extension of the family, the tribe, the nation. Right? It all depends on what we mean by these words and these terms. Now, America and Americanism is the first attempt at a completely propositional nation. And this is well known. This is not debated in political theory. I think even Abraham Lincoln referred to it that way. And what that means is that now you join this confederation almost like joining a company or corporation. And so America is much like a corporate entity, more so than it was, more so than the idea of a people group ever before. Now, there are some advantages to this. It does appear to produce quite a bit of wealth, especially given the geography of America, the wealth that's here in terms of natural resources, so forth and so on. But to believe or to characterize the world as going in the direction it is because of Marxism is really ridiculous. Unless you mean corporate Marxism, which is actually what's being promoted. So when Stefan Molyneux and Stixon Hexenhammer and these people talk about Marxism, they don't know what they're talking about. They haven't read where Marx talks about the goods of capitalism and how Marx said capitalism would be a stage to take us to the full-blown communism that he envisioned. They don't know that Marx talked about the goodness of open borders and free trade. So again, we're living in wacko land where people who don't have actual educations and any philosophical grounding in real logic and real metaphysics and real ethics in terms of the history of Western philosophy and theology, these people know nothing about theology. Davos. Trump is going to Davos, the World Economic Forum's giant globalist venue where all of the snakes and vipers of the world, the 2,500 or so top 1%, right under the eye of the pyramid individuals are going to be meeting to discuss policy and planning and so forth. And this has for a long time, especially after the Bretton Woods system collapsed right around 1972-73, the shock doctrine and all that with Nixon and the gold standard. We still have the dollar as the world reserve currency, of course, but what happened was we began to transition into full-on globalism. So the Cold War, as we've said many times, was this managed dialectic largely to destroy Russia and to destroy Germany, the two chief opponents of the Western power bloc. And the Western power bloc has had the same leaders we're proposing, Atlanticism, right? The same leadership, roughly speaking, for several hundred years. Now, before we set the stage, before we get into that, we want to set the stage with Trump and globalism and all this. Now,